Irashaimase. Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this week we have Stinger. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Saibu Kaihatsu, Stinger released to arcades in 1983. Now jumped to July of 2025, and it's available as an arcade archive title for the PlayStation 4 and the Nintendo Switch, which is the version we're looking at today. This is another one of those titles I love to see as an arcade archive. It's an obscure shoot 'em up that in this case happens to be Saibu Kaihatsu's not only their first shoot 'em up, but also the first title the company ever released. So as far as that's concerned, it's a really awesome classic arcade title, and it's actually one that I think is super interesting. So if you like classic arcade shoot 'em ups, definitely check this one out. When we first put credits in the machine, you'll see it supports 1 or 2 players. However, it's 2 players alternating, so keep that in mind. Starting the game, one of the first things you might notice is that it's a vertical screen. However, the game is a horizontal scroller, something that's a bit more unique, especially given the era. It provides for a lot of up and down movement, but things do feel a little bit squished with the left and right, and that especially becomes apparent a little bit later on in the stage itself. As far as what we have for attacks, so there's 2 attacks that are available for our Stinger fighter. We have our primary shot, which is admittedly this awesome dual shot. Then there's also something called a bongo call, and I'll show that off here in a little bit. The bongos are also a unique mechanic as far as both being able to power up your ship and earn additional points. So overall, we'll continue to work through the stage here, seeing different waves of enemies appear through the background. But one of the things that's really unique and interesting about this title is this section here. So we get to points where you can actually land or, well, move on the ground itself. And one of the things that you can do here is it changes our shot from that dual shot to this bomb to work on these ground enemies. However, there's also these robots here, the bongos. So if you touch the bongos themselves, you'll basically be saving them. And if you can fill up that meter that's filling up at the bottom, you'll get 600 points, which for this title is actually a fair bit. In addition to that, you'll get an additional bongo call. We can have a total of 5 bongo calls. Then once you have that, if you fill up the meter one more time, you'll actually power up the ship, which is something that's really awesome for the era. Although you do have to be careful with all those enemies on the ground, on those ground sections. It's possible to both lose some lives quickly if you're focusing on getting the bongos. In addition to that, if the bongos touch an enemy, then, well, that's it for them. So what do the bongos do for us? Well, if you actually activate them, they'll move around the ship initially, and then they'll home in on the enemies, going and dealing a substantial amount of damage. It's actually a great way to take care of a lot of enemies on screen. However, they don't stick around too terribly long. I do find them extremely useful to use when you're encountering specifically those large spheres that bounce off your lasers, the gigaspheres. Otherwise, they're extremely difficult to damage as they will suck you in. You have to get close in on those enemies to be able to defeat them. However, if you use a bongo call, then the bongo will make really short work of those enemies. So the game does have a checkpoint system if you lose a life, but I feel that overall the checkpoints are fairly generous. It doesn't set you too far back. Initially, you'll just have life at the 2,000. You'll earn additional lives at the 20,000 and the 50,000 unless you change the extend points in the settings themselves. You can also increase your lives from the starting 3 lives to 5 in the settings. Other than that, the settings are fairly basic with this particular shoot 'em up. So now we've come to another ground section, and the stages themselves are fairly long. They do loop in a similar fashion, but one of the things that's neat about this one is you'll get additional enemies when you enter in the second loop. We're ultimately trying to reach the end of the stage where we'll encounter a boss called a Biotron. That boss is ultimately the enemy that will end the stage itself, and getting to that point, it does take some time. So the stages, the loops, basically as it were, are quite lengthy, and they can be a bit of a challenge. So you kind of have to decide, especially with these ground sections here, are you going after getting additional bongos, or are you looking for survival and sometimes the points? So you can see here, surrounded by enemies, the bongo touched one of these spin tanks, and as I said earlier, that's it for them. Also, when you get to the end of the ground section, even if you're touching them, you can't actually increase that meter. So you might have seen the first loop between the base section that we were traveling through and the one that we just moved through, that there was something like a space station in the background, a really neat looking enemy boss here. And as we move throughout the stage, it gets closer and closer. So the second time through, we see it significantly closer, but it starts to fire at us. Unfortunately, that isn't actually a boss, it's just an orbital defense platform. And here's a good point to go and call out the bongo, as it will go and take care of the enemy shots coming from that platform, as well as help us get with the additional enemies. And without getting to the Biotron at the end of Stage 1, that's basically what we have for Stinger. Especially given that this title released in 1983, and it was the first title from Saibu at the time, Denshi. I think this one's a really unique, awesome shoot-'em-up, like especially, as I was saying, for the era. But as far as the minus flavors are concerned, if there's one thing I do have to complain about, it's that there's not much variety to the music track, and you're really going and listening to the main music track for most of your run. There are a couple sections where things will change up when you encounter the area right before the boss itself, the Biotron, and when you use a bongo, the music will temporarily change as well. Other than that, it's basically the same track playing on loop. Initially, it's not bad, but it does start to get a bit grating. And then trying to save the bongos themselves can sometimes be frustrating as well, as depending on where they spawn, sometimes they'll, even before you can see them on the screen, they'll spawn with an enemy behind them just like that, and there's no chance to do anything to them. They'll just run to the enemy, and that'll be it for them. So I wish it was a little easier to try and save those guys, but it does make it really satisfying when you can successfully pull it off. But as far as the plus flavors are concerned, the biggest thing I have about this title is I just love that it's does what I feel like the Arcade Archives is really great for, and that's preserving a classic shoot-'em-up that's fairly obscure, and in this case really important in the history of a company like Saibu Kaihatsu, their first title released as well as their first shoot-'em-up. So you can kind of see that this might have been one of those things that would have led to the Raiden franchise all those years later. So having this little page in history is one of those things that I really do love about Hamster and their work with the Arcade Archives. And then as far as the plus flavors are concerned, the biggest one for me is this just classic arcade goodness, and this one is actually a pretty decent shoot-'em-up once again for the era. But even setting that aside, in general, I feel like this one is just a lot of fun to sit down and play. The mechanics of trying to go and get the high scores with the bongos, as well as that particular mechanic of them being kind of like a homing bomb, as it were, is something that I think was really unique and interesting for the time. Having the differences between the two sections of stage, where you have the ground section here as well as the flying section, is also something that seems really unique and just innovative for the time. So with that said, as far as Arcade Archive titles are concerned, especially if you're a fan of classic arcade shoot-'em-ups, then Stinger is an easy recommend from the chef. And with that, we find ourselves at the end of this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, we want to thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful week yourself, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.